Before opening this video, many probably thought, a video about Irish gangs for an hour and a half, what? But there have been a few movies about them, and the theme pops up in series. So what comes next? They're not Italians, not Latin American cartels, not even organized crime groups. What can one even talk about for a whole hour and a half? I thought the same. But when our team began delving into the topic of Irish gangs, I noticed something. Almost in any film where there are Irish people and crime, they are always playing supporting roles. They loyally serve as henchmen from sunny Sicily, as Scorsese showed in The Irishman, or they hang out in the background, like in the Cotton Club. They are the shadows behind the backs of Cosa Nostra, but no more. It turned out that this cinematic stereotype doesn't match reality at all. Maybe Irish gangs were never as influential as Latin American cartels, but they had the leading American politicians on a leash. Their crimes and subculture aren't written about by rappers like the gangs of Los Angeles, and yet they are constantly in league with various celebrities. Here, for example, mixed martial arts star Conor McGregor is hanging out with a mogul from the Irish cartel. And then we see boxer Tyson Fury defending himself, claiming he is not associated with the leader of this organized crime group named Kinahan. To understand, there's a $15 million reward for this criminal's head. Irish groups have never been notorious for their brutality like the Salvadorans of MS-13. But despite this, they have been hated, feared, and couldn't be broken for more than 150 years. And what's most surprising is that behind this monstrous criminal picture lies a tragedy. A tragedy of a small but very militant nation whose distorted and tortured historical memory has made the criminal world tremble for the third century in a row. We compiled a complete anthology of Irish gangs. If you watch this video to the end, you will learn the reason why Ireland lost half of its population in 5 years, how it became the poorest and then the richest country in Europe, surpassing Norway. Why did the Democratic Party of the USA sponsor the most dangerous organized crime groups in America? How did economic growth give rise to the most influential Irish gang of our time? Where did Martin Scorsese lie? And why is Conor McGregor really so audacious? We will also not forget about the main Irish cutthroats. I will tell you how they profited from robbery, arms trade, and drug trafficking. Why they befriended politicians, intimidated athletes, and bribed cops. There will be hitmen with a code of honor and madmen with a thirst for power. Everything as expected in our Mafia history series. Every year, on the 4th of July, Americans celebrate Independence Day. Families gather for barbecues, launch fireworks, and have fun. Across the country, from Boston to Seattle, it's festively noisy. But in 1857 in New York, this day became especially loud. More precisely, in the 5 Points area. This is a neighborhood in the heart of Manhattan. Today, just steps away from there stands the Brooklyn Bridge and the most famous Chinatown in the United States. However, if you found yourself there in the mid-19th century, you would not be struck by dim sums with pork or Peking duck, but by something else entirely. At that time, these corners were the most criminal areas in the city. Everywhere there was destitution, thieves, robbers who did not mind getting their hands dirty. The pervasive misery was compounded by throngs of migrants who flooded the area. They survived under hellish conditions. Many wasted away from hunger and succumbed to cholera and consumption. A veritable hell on earth. Yet for the 5 Points, this was typical everyday life. But the events of July 1857 horrified even the locals, who seemed to have grown accustomed to everything. If you had been in that neighborhood on that day, you would not have immediately understood what was happening. It seemed like an ordinary late evening. But suddenly some commotion ensues in the street. Vendors start closing their stalls, women yell at their children to run home quickly, and quietly whisper something about the Virgin Mary. At your raised eyebrows, and the question frozen in your eyes, what is happening here, pray tell? The sounds of gunfire serve as the answer. The streets are filled with some terrifying individuals. They wield pikes with the carcasses of rabbits mounted on them. These brutes quickly spot butchers from the opposing camp. Immediately, the massacre begins, a full-scale brawl. Gunfire erupts everywhere. Knives, stones, bricks are thrown. Even people are tossed from the rooftops of neighboring houses. Every hour, new fighters arrive, replacing those who forever remain on the ground. The police do not even attempt to intervene. Chances are you have a single question. What kind of hell is happening here? Nothing special, just the largest armed gang clash of the 19th century. In the right corner of the ring are the furious Irishmen, brandishing dead rabbits. Their gang is aptly named the Dead Rabbits. This is the very group from Scorsese's legendary film Gangs of New York. In the left corner of the ring is the Bowery Boys gang. Their leader is William Bill, nicknamed the Butcher. The former are Irish migrants, while the latter are locals who utterly despise the Irish. The residents of New York in those years can be characterized by the word locals. The terrifying bloodshed continued for 2 days. There were so many corpses and maimed bodies on the ground that the gangsters constantly stumbled over the lifeless forms. On the first day, the New York police did absolutely nothing. On the second day, when journalists began to raise alarms, the cops attempted to take control of the situation, arresting anyone they could indiscriminately, but stopping the massacre proved futile. Then Isaiah Rinders took the stage, a businessman, politician, and the most influential Irish criminal of those years. The killing ceased only after the matter escalated to the New York mayor's office. Once again, to restore peace in the city and stop the blood-crazed gangsters, the police sought help from the biggest gangster himself. It is important to understand this. Irish gangs could no longer be stopped by force alone. They had become a headache not only for New York, but for America as a whole. Similar outbreaks of disorder involving the Irish were occurring across the country. For example, in Muhammad Ali's hometown of Louisville, Kentucky, Irish people were burned alive right inside churches. In Baltimore, Irish people and their opponents were cutting each other down at polling stations during elections. How could such things happen? To begin with, let's rewind and figure out how the Irish ended up in America in the first place. Why wouldn't they just stay on their green island? At first glance, the logic seems straightforward. The Irish are neither Jewish nor Romani, who lived as diasporas in various places and were forced to constantly resettle. The Irish are descendants of the Celts. This ancient people had their own land throughout history, protected on all sides by the sea, along with a semblance of statehood. In Ireland there were clans, lords and kingdoms, albeit rather frail ones. This is an important detail for us. Therefore, when their prim and proper neighbour, the English, began to rise in power, Ireland's fate was sealed. Britain, which was then just the Kingdom of England, laid its hands on Ireland as early as the 12th century. Colonisation was initiated by the then King, Henry II. The English looked down on their neighbours, and understandably so. They were stronger and wealthier, and Irish lands were much more fertile than those in England. It would be a sin for such wealth to go to waste. After all, the island is situated right at the western borders of Britain. If the Celtic land is not seized in time, your sworn friends, whether France or Spain, will do it, and if not today, then tomorrow, Ireland will become a staging ground for an invasion of England. There is no doubt about that. Let us not forget the cultural differences. You are well acquainted with how the English language sounds, whereas here is Irish Gaelic. The native language of the Irish sounds soft and musical, like a mix of Danish and Dutch. Soon the English would take control of the island. England began to shape itself as an empire, and Ireland, in effect, became an English colony. It retained this status for a long 8 centuries. Initially, London controlled the island through earls, appointees of the English crown. Clan chiefs were coerced into swearing vassal allegiance to them. Then the Irish were belittled through a policy of devastation. The English confiscated land, dismantled Irish customs, imposed their Anglo-Norman system, and, of course, strictly monitored tax collection. In the 14th century, the Statute of Kilkenny emerged. In effect, it was a ban on Irish culture, prohibiting the language, traditional clothing, and even mixed marriages. Fortunately, the enforcement of this law was not strictly observed, but the case is illustrative. Although the Irish had no chances against the English, they tried to resist. The most notable attempt was the 1798 rebellion. The Irish drew inspiration from the example of the Great French Revolution and even sought support from France in the form of personnel. However, they failed to bring sufficient military forces, so the Irish had to advance on their own. By sheer determination, they won a couple of battles, but it was all in vain. After a couple of months, the English brutally suppressed the uprising. As a result, 2,000 crown soldiers and tens of thousands of rebels perished. To consolidate their success, the English conducted mass repressions. They hanged and shot rebels, burned homes and killed women and children. There were many such unsuccessful rebellions in Ireland. When viewed from the outside, a common problem becomes immediately apparent. Descendants of Celts do not know how to negotiate among themselves. They are forever hindered by old grievances, quarrels, and not even a formidable common enemy can unite the disparate clans. As a result, by the 18th century, the Irish effectively became a people with a country but without a homeland. What, Irishman, do you want to live where you were born and where your ancestors' graves are? You have to rent a patch of land from an English landlord. He lives somewhere in Yorkshire. He has never been to Ireland, but the land where you and all your neighbours live is his on paper. Want to send a parcel to your grandmother in a neighbouring province? Learn the new English street names? Your native language can basically be forgotten. Want to trade? Trade, but only at the prices and volumes that are profitable to the English lords. London artificially set up Ireland's economy to its own benefit. They restricted trade with other countries and allowed them to engage only in agriculture. Suffice it to say, the English didn't even consider them equal human beings. For them, the Irish were barbarians, exemplified by the racism of the year 1899, where the Irish were depicted as descendants of black people, unlike the Anglo-Teutons with their Roman profiles, high foreheads and piercing gazes. As a result, Ireland turned into an agricultural appendage of the eastern neighbour. But even that wasn't enough for the English. The corn laws of the first half of the 19th century dropped the prices for almost all the crops that the Irish grew. For example, a bushel of grain, which is dozens of kilos, could not be sold for more than 20 shillings per piece. In those times, you couldn't even buy a sheep for that money, and they couldn't trade with anyone else. To simply survive, they had to grow the recently adopted potato. It thrived well in rocky terrain. And there was no sense in trading it. It was too cheap a product, and enormous volumes were needed for trade. 2/3 of Irish households then subsisted solely on potatoes. This love for potatoes would play its own tragic role in Irish history. Before returning to the butchers and cutthroats, we must also talk about spiritual sustenance. There were problems with this as well. England at that moment was intensely cultivating its version of Protestantism, Anglicanism. The Vatican did not want to lose its influence over the English, which it had always had. As a result, Rome incited France and Spain against England, arranging various conspiracies. They did not succeed in bringing England back to Catholicism. In fact, quite the opposite occurred. The English came to hate Catholics, and the Irish, to their misfortune, were predominantly Catholic. The Irish were never considered first-class humans, as it was. There may have been discrimination against red-haired people with freckles, but with the church conflict, they ceased to be regarded as people at all. Punitive laws were introduced. The Irish were prohibited from owning cattle, tools, and land. Public service and education were also things one could forget about, not to mention the prohibition of religious practices. It was almost a state of servitude. But in the 19th century, things became even worse. Then something occurred that devout Irish people considered the beginning of the apocalypse. Their perspective is understandable. The rider of war had already traversed their lands. Then a failure of crops struck. Moreover, 1 year of crop failure followed another. Potatoes, which fed almost the entire country, were destroyed by potato blight. This is a plant fungal disease from which today's fertilizers can provide protection. But back then, this ailment triggered the most severe famine in the history of the entire island. At some point, Britain came to its senses and attempted to help its vassals survive somehow. It was not particularly successful, to put it mildly. The real catastrophe began when John Russell, a conservative, and the grandfather of the famous philosopher Bertrand Russell, took the helm of economic reforms. The grandson is remembered in history for defending pacifism ideals. The grandfather also believed in high ideals, market ones. What did he decide? No government support for the Irish was needed anymore. The starving would be aided by the right hand of the market and philanthropists. As it turned out, this decision was not based on faith in Adam Smith, but the conviction that this was how God decided to punish the heretics. So why go against the will of the Almighty who disliked Catholics? We won't go there. We don't need to be there. The consequences of this decision were horrifying. In 5 years, approximately 1 million people died of starvation and epidemics. This was nearly every 8th resident of Ireland. The consequences of the Great Famine, as it was known in the history of the country, still haunt Ireland today. A recent study showed that the likelihood of a person becoming a revolutionary when the Irish fought for independence increased depending on how severely the Great Famine affected their region. The more people that had perished there in the past, the higher the probability of producing a rebel. Football fans still use the Great Famine to insult the Irish during international matches. For example, a banner at the Italy-Ireland match read, "The famine is over. Go home, potato eaters." The Great Famine, in addition to being a cultural wound, left a demographic trauma, and it's not just about mortality. The Irish decided that the rider of the apocalypse was pointing them to the door. Amidst the famine, more than 2 million people left the country. Along with the deceased million, the country lost almost half of its citizens. Most of those who survived fled to the United States. What would await you on this journey if you were Irish and decided in the mid-19th century to cross the ocean to save some kind of future? Well, for starters, there are a lot of people like you. This is not something one could say about ships that could carry you across the Atlantic. Secondly, a one-way ticket would cost very, very much, not forgetting that you'd have to bring your entire family. Thirdly, you would not travel in the economy class of a comfortable airplane, but on a very specific kind of ship. Such a vessel was called a coffin ship. Tiny cabins were packed like sardines, almost devoid of light. Under such conditions, you couldn't bring much in the way of provisions, and no one promised access to clean water either. Forget about hygiene, toilets, and personal space. And this was a major problem. After all, sharing this coffin with you were 1,000 people, hundreds of whom were already afflicted with cholera and typhus. Complaints about seasickness and nausea were best reserved for tourist walks. And now the final blow. In this hellish coffin, brace yourself to spend, get ready, from 40 to 60 days. By the end of the journey, however, it would become less crowded. On average, out of 10 brave souls who boarded this coffin in Ireland, at best 7, at worst 5, would reach American shores. Everything depended on how much the captain cared about the passengers and how quickly those who couldn't endure the journey were thrown overboard. You were well aware of all the pleasures of this sea voyage in advance. Yet staying in your homeland seemed even worse. The image of America in the 19th century was alluring. It was something. They had just shed the yoke of your enemies, the hated England. A land of the future, where railroads, shipbuilding and new technologies like the telegraph were developing. A place where anyone, through hard work, could earn a decent life. But if the Irish were lucky enough to reach America, they would look around and realize they had landed in some kind of bad dream. To discuss again the antics of the red-headed ruffians who love ale, let's meet the MacDonald family. Before us are typical Irish refugees of the mid-19th century. The head of the family was a cobbler, the mother a housewife, unable to read or write, burdened with 3 scamps. Our protagonists left the shores of their native island before the start of the Great Famine, in anticipation of a new, dignified life in America. Reality poured a bucket of ice water over their heads. It quickly became apparent that being Irish in free America was not much better than in the relentless Britain they had fled. Prejudices against migrants were everywhere, from the labour and housing markets to the sentiments of journalists. Look at this notice from the New York Times in the year 1854. No Irish need apply. This phrase could be found on store signs and in any newspaper with advertisements for job seekers. But how could this be possible? All right, we're in the 19th century, where racism was considered a conventional worldview, but the Irish had fair skin, fluent English, European culture. Why the hatred then? The fact was that truly white people in the USA at that time were considered to be only WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. There's a popular video game called BioShock Infinite. The action takes place in the imaginary American town of Columbia, floating in the skies. The strictest Puritans live there, believing in the holy founding fathers, the chosen nature of the American people, and the sacred dollar. It's quite a vivid satire of those very WASPs. At the bottom of society in BioShock are Asians, African Americans, and the Irish. This is no accident. Chauvinism towards the Irish began in the Middle Ages with the ease of Pope Adrian IV. On his mother's side, he was English. So without any qualms, he decreed that all Irish, Scots, and Welsh were barbarians. Vengeance. This usual spite from a high-ranking individual became the rule for centuries. As soon as our heroes, the MacDonalds, arrived in the New World, they came to a sad realization. The order here was pretty much the same as in our homeland. Gentlemen in expensive suits discussed us behind our backs, saying something about inherent stupidity, love for alcohol, and laziness. The mothers of local children were no better. They taught their sons and daughters to keep away from the MacDonald miners because they allegedly spread diseases and taught bad habits. The MacDonalds were often called inside-out Negroes, while the local African Americans were referred to as smoked Irishmen. In such conditions, finding work was hard enough, much less understanding how to live at all. As a bonus, the MacDonald family was not alone in coming to America. Millions of other Irish brought with them diseases and grief from which they drank excessively. Overall, the practice of alcoholism only reinforced stereotypes, but that was only half of the problem. The labour market quivered from the influx of migrants. The Irish were ready to work for pennies. They toiled for 12 or even 16 hours a day. Women earned $4 a month for household work. That was exactly the cost of renting a small room on the city's outskirts. Men in factories earned more, up to 75 cents per shift, if they were lucky. Americans felt that the Irish had taken over all possible jobs. Consider the notional John Smith, a third-generation American Protestant. And one day his boss comes up to him at the factory and says that now you, Smith, will receive 1.5 times less and work twice as much. Don't like it? Leave. There's a whole line of Mikes and Paddies waiting to take your place. Those were stereotypical names for Irishmen at the time. Smith was unlucky. His employer wasn't an old-fashioned chauvinist and valued profit over ideological principles. And so this New York native gathers with his friends in a bar to curse these immigrant Irishmen, one glass, another. And soon, a crowd of angry workers heads to the district where our Mikes and Paddies live. A riot begins. Unfortunately for the MacDonalds, they see everything happening with their own eyes. These rioters would come to be known as natives. They hated the Irish for being immigrants, for taking their jobs, and of course they hated them for their faith. WASP Protestants considered Catholics an existential threat to America. They demonized Catholic priests. In church rituals they saw pagan motifs. And in Irish traditions, debauchery and looseness. What normal Christian would drink at a holiday? What are these unabashed dances, such depravity? In cities with Irish diasporas, natives carried out raids on Catholic districts. They wrecked homes and shops, set churches on fire. And the outsiders, as they were called, could be killed. There is a legend that one time the natives were so fierce during another anti-Irish riot that they nearly burned all of Philadelphia. Do you remember the Bowery Boys from the beginning of the story? Those who fought with the Irish in the centre of New York? Members of this gang were originally from WASP, who hated the Irish and at the same time all Catholics. They saw themselves almost as sanitarians, purging their homeland of the plague that had reached them from across the ocean. Now try once again to imagine yourself as an Irish immigrant. You are burdened with suffering in your native land, which neither you nor your children possessed and would no longer possess. You miraculously survived the horrors of the Great Famine, burying a dozen neighbours, friends and relatives. You endured hellish ordeals on a coffin ship, fleeing to a new world that you dreamed of as a haven of peace and prosperity. And ultimately, you live in poverty, discrimination and violence from the same Protestants you fled from, albeit these Protestants in a new guise. Some continued to endure, the McDonalds would do so, but there were people of a different sort. A man named James lost his arm in a factory, unable to withstand the atmosphere of New York. The Irish community also did not care about him, but he did not give up and left to seek his fortune in other states. Remember this man without an arm. For our story, he is an important character, but many neither fled nor surrendered. The Irish quickly understood that the best defence is a good offence. The base of the Irish Avengers became the 5 Points in New York. The 5 Points became not only home to thousands of Irish, but also a battlefield with the natives. Almost every day someone was killed there. There's a widespread legend that in just one house, the old brewery, there was at least one murder a day. It is a typical tenement house with cheap apartments where Irish workers crammed in by the dozens. Gradually, the area was filled by other immigrants, including the Italians. They too absorbed this spirit of Irish rebels. For instance, they saw how Paul Kelly operated, the founder of the infamous 5 Points Gang, one of the most significant gangs 150 years ago in America. Paul entered the criminal world through illegal fights, proved himself an excellent boxer, and moved into extortion. Soon, Irish gangs began extorting businesses from ordinary peace-loving neighbours, from their own neighbours, the Irish. Before our eyes, once defenders of their people began turning into bloodthirsty feudal lords. They continued to wage war against pogromists and rival gangs, but there was no talk anymore of unity within the diaspora. Ordinary Irish could not respond in any way. Going to the police meant you would be snitching on your own, and that is the most disgraceful sin. The community would not accept you after that. Moreover, the cops were unlikely to want to meddle in the affairs of social outcasts. It was easier for them to ignore it. The more Irish gangsters there are, the fewer Irish gangsters there would be. The only way out for an Irishman whose kin have wrecked his business, beaten his father, and taken his sisters into sexual slavery is to gather his own gang and seek revenge. Not against the descendants of the Anglo-Saxons, but against his own fellow sufferers. What kind of social drama is this? Why, despite a common dangerous enemy, did the Irish unabashedly kill each other? The answer lies on the colourful streets of New York City in the 1870s. On July 12th, they organise a traditional Irish parade here. People engage in festivities, congratulate passers-by, dance to national music, and suddenly this cheerful procession is attacked. Bottles and bricks rain down from the windows, shooting and chaos ensue. Crowds beat and slash each other, and the scenery is filled with blood and corpses. And no, this is not another native action against migrants, not bandits, not religious fanatics. The most ordinary Irish set about slaughtering other Irish. The main division turned out to be religious again, but from where? Aren't all the Irish Catholics? Not quite. In fact, there were already plenty of Protestants among the migrants for years. The Irish had been migrating to the States even before the potato famine. Many of them changed denomination due to English laws, which, for instance, prohibited inheritance transmission to non-Protestants. Others changed their denomination once in the States. Essentially, by the time their Catholic brethren arrived, they had somewhat settled. And then waves of hungry, poor and sick relatives started pouring in. The incomes of the Celtic Protestants began to plummet sharply. So Irish Protestants viewed Irish Catholics like relatives whose arrival you did not expect, who irritate you from the first minute, and you count the days until they leave. They were infuriated that because of these newcomers they were compared to migrants. Some Irish began to join the Protestant movement for British rule over Ireland. Their heart no longer ached for their homeland, and Protestant faith was just right. Catholic gangs did not tolerate this attitude towards themselves for long. In the 1870s, the Irish across America began staging what were called the Orange Riots. Irish Catholics attacked fellow Irish Protestants wherever they could reach. The incident at the Irish parade is of the same nature. It should be emphasized that such fragmentation is part of Irish nature. The Celts, their descendants, were never a monolith that stands against a common enemy. In reality, Irish clans much preferred to fight each other. The main philosophy of these gangs is the family above the community. We will help you, of course, but if things get tight, You find a way to make it on your own. I have to feed my family. For comparison, recall the initiation ritual in the Italian Mafia. Are you ready to kill a brother from your old family for the new family? An Italian is ready to go to any lengths for the Mafia. Michael Corleone, who killed his own brother, can attest to that. Hence the nature of Irish gangs. They are all small, bite other groups, and rarely unite. They lack the rigid hierarchy found in the Italian or Mexican cartels. Moreover, throughout their criminal history, the Irish have worked as outsourced mercenaries. Believe me, the Thieves' Guild could not measure up to them in professionalism and ruthlessness. Before you is the price list of services provided by the Wyos, a gang that terrorized New York 140 years ago. For a good strike, an Irishman received 10 cups of coffee or 4 glasses of cheap whiskey at a bar. One outing with a bat could cover a month's rent for a modest 2-room apartment in Manhattan. A big job could cover the costs of 2 revolvers, ammunition, and a fine suit. A gentleman's kit in exchange for a human life taken. The main problem with this business model was seeking orders on freelance, especially in a highly competitive environment, which was quite the headache. Therefore, gangs had to settle down with regular customers. Frank Sheeran, whose story inspired Martin Scorsese's film The Irishman, chose just such a career. His employer was the Italian Bufalino family, but that's more of a modern story. The Irish of the 19th century had no connection with Italians, especially Sicilians, because there were not that many of them in the United States at the time. Nonetheless, they found a principal customer. It became the Democratic Party of the United States. Do not be surprised. Under its wing operated Tammany Hall, which in the 19th century became the most powerful political machine in New York City. An informal structure through which the party controlled votes and appointments using cronyism, bribery, and personal connections rather than transparent procedures. Democrats at the time understood that masses of Irish could be turned to their advantage. They wanted a passport, and Democrats needed votes during elections. Thus, Tammany Hall started actively assisting the Irish diaspora. Immigrants received rations, got jobs in municipal services, and in return, Democrats helped them with documents, and after a few years, they became US citizens. The Irish were grateful and always voted responsibly for the party of donkeys in elections. The electoral effect was colossal. By the year 1850, every 4th resident of New York was Irish. It sounds like a conspiracy theory, but such political machines, as Tammany Hall was called, are a completely real story. The rise in crime became another window of opportunity for this organization. For the entire second half of the 19th century, politics in New York could not be envisioned without the brave lads wielding clubs. Almost all the gangs we've talked about served the interests of this party offshoot. Furthermore, the gangsters regularly conducted raids against the competitors of these party members. They were no fools and hired their watchdogs. Bowery boys and other gangsters with whom the Irish regularly clashed were mercenaries of the native party. For their work, gangs received money and almost complete immunity. Tammany Hall fully took the police under its control, so they did not interfere with the Irish affairs. Irish gangs were a convenient tool for activists to solve problems which they could discard at any moment. At least, that's what they thought. The massacre with which we began our report shuffled all the cards. What appeared as chaos to the average citizen was, for politicians, the exchange of pieces on the New York chessboard. The Irish gangs did not waste time. They skillfully used the protection they received from the Democrats. They accumulated their initial capital through racketeering and underground clubs, and decided they had gained enough strength to compete on equal footing with their elders. In general, from the 1940s, a whole generation of people grew up whose homeland was not Ireland, but those very slums with their harsh laws and gangs. The 5 points raised true hungry wolves who knew, either you eat or you'll be eaten. This is how the residents of New York remembered the Wyos gang, with their intricate price list. In their free time, they loitered in bars and clubs owned by the key figures of the organization. It is said that the names of these establishments were self-explanatory: the Morgue, Milligan's Hell. Bar owners boasted that their liquor was versatile, helping to quickly get drunk, and if necessary, suitable for body embalming. As they say, every joke has a grain of truth. In just one morgue alone, there were about 100 murders. If you think these were the actions of the natives, then no. The Irish, in significant inebriation, extinguished each other. The Irish gangs could not see the forest for the trees. By the end of the 19th century, they no longer needed to fight against the natives. As you remember, New York was already a quarter Irish city, but despite this, they continued to quarrel over petty issues. The Irish began to lose New York, but in those same years further west, amidst smoke, blood and iron, their people laid the first stone, the foundation of a real empire. Do you remember the MacDonald family we talked about? They have a specific historical prototype, the family of Michael Cassius MacDonald, a character who became the king of the criminal world of Chicago. As a young man, he witnessed the humiliations his family had to endure. Spittings, contempt, pogroms, pennies for honest work as a cobbler. This was not the life they dreamed of. But the young man did not waste time. Constantly running through the streets, he quickly realized where the thriving gambling houses of the city operated, where people squandered hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. When he turned 18, he plunged headlong into the industry. He roamed the gambling houses, talked with the owners, in short, studied all the ins and outs of the market. There he understood that no matter how talented you are, you won't earn much. To get rich, you have to control all business processes completely. But Mike decided to build his empire precisely in Chicago. Why there and not in the South? In the 19th century, it seemed like a real backwater. The population was 3 times smaller than that of Philadelphia. The infrastructure was poor. But Mike discerned an untouched jewel in Chicago. Unlike the East Coast, there were no Irishmen there. Therefore, there was no ill treatment towards them. Moreover, the city itself had not yet been fully constructed. Irish immigrants, alongside the locals, were transforming this backwater into the fastest-growing city in America. Irish people were regarded as full-fledged Americans there. As a bonus, criminal gangs had not yet set down roots in the city. No, underground clubs were already functioning. The streets were full of small-time gangsters. But for now, it was chaos. Shadowless, wild, unpredictable, and most importantly, it didn't bring in decent money. Michael MacDonald decided that he could change that. He started small once again. He established connections with local gangs, studied how the underworld business was structured. But now, Mike was also friends with local officials. This became an ace up the sleeve of the future gambling magnate. He first played this card during the Civil War. The Northerners had spread recruitment centers throughout all their states. Any adult citizen could show up there, receive a salary, and head off with a rifle to fight the Confederates. Irishmen often went there. Between 150,000 and 200,000 of them joined the Union Army. But only one Irishman figured out how to truly profit from the war, our clever Mike. He invented a scheme which can be conditionally called a disappearing act. Mike helped recruitment centers find new military manpower. He would bring a certain Paddy MacGuffin to them and direct him to the recruiting station. Then, through Mike, a certain Paul would be registered with the Union forces. Following him would be James, Kevin, Connor, Andrew, and it was Mike who, with all his good, broad Irish heart, helped them join the troops. For this, he, of course, took his cut. You may ask, so where's the trick? It's standard recruiting work, nothing criminal. The trick, my friends, is that all these Paddies, Pauls, Kevins and Andrews, all these soldiers were the same person. Mike would cycle the same person through the same recruiting centers, collect salaries, vanish, and then return for them again. How was he not caught with such a carousel? A counter-question, how would you plan on catching him? In the 19th century, there were no digital catalogues, nor were there any coherent databases. The documents shown by recruits didn't even have photographs. The entire business scheme relied on recruitment center workers not recognizing recruit Paddy, who had received his salary a week ago and disappeared. To cover all bases, just in case, Mike took a cut with the officials he had been friends with for years. This story highlighted the 2 main credos of Mike's game. The first was reliance on connections. Finding the right person was sometimes far more useful than another shop from which you could extort money. MacDonald's was not a brute by nature. Unlike his New York colleagues, he was a spider, weaving officials, big money, and new connections into his web. Mike's spider nature also manifested in his second principle, minimal participation. He no longer ran with your legs, no longer sought adventures for himself. Mike constructed a precise clockwork mechanism where everyone had their designated place and performed their strictly assigned function. The scheme of recruiting deserters was his initial trial. Later, Mike hired his own recruiters and took a cut from their commission. He then complicated the structure so much that he created an entire network of straw men and intermediaries. Some forged documents, others dealt with army clerks, and still others trained recruits on how to escape from camps before being sent to the front. When the business started bringing in significant money, he decided to scale it nationwide. Now, Mike operated not only in Chicago, but also in other cities. The war for MacDonald was like a nurturing mother. We don't have exact data on how much he defrauded the US Army. MacDonald was no fool, so he didn't boast about it to everyone he met. But we can at least estimate this amount. Look, the Northerners paid differently for each new recruit depending on the region and the situation at the front. The range was from $100 to $1,000 of that time. In Chicago and nearby regions, the swing was smaller. On average, recruiting one recruit was valued at 5 of those bills, with the fierce eagle, the symbol of free America. A decent portion of the money went to bribes, payment for intermediaries' services, and other personnel, but MacDonald would not have become the master of Chicago if he engaged in an unprofitable business, and he handled this money cautiously. Unlike the Irish in New York, MacDonald didn't spend his money on alcohol, women, and fancy clothes. The capital acquired through such labor, he invested in what would bring him millions: the gambling business. The gambling houses of Chicago in those years lacked a systematic approach and financial plan, relying at best on primitive schemes of deceit that wouldn't earn much. Backroom casinos went bankrupt as often as their patrons did. MacDonald did not see himself in the same boat as these losers. The primary feature of his establishment was that people were not cheated, well, not during the game itself. Mike didn't interfere with the natural order of things. It was not for him to decide who should get lucky. But those whom luck abandoned, he exploited with interest. Judge for yourself. If a gambling addict enters the establishment, sooner or later he will surely lose all his money. When that happened, the unfortunate would likely think, well, if I just had a little more money, I would definitely win it back. And at that moment, what luck? A business-like gentleman approaches and offers a small loan. As you might understand, players didn't just leave without money, they left deeply in microdebts. The moneylender who approached the poor fellow was not random, but another cog in MacDonald's mechanism. At the Irishman's casino, you either simply lost everything or became his debtor. A win-win strategy. Not only the stylish collars were counted among the debtors. Judges, officials, police officers, all the necessary people of Chicago eventually ended up in Mike's ledger of debts. But that wasn't enough for him. He understood that influential debtors could become angry, unite, and erase him from the city's face. Status was needed. The armor that would have made Mike invulnerable was the store. MacDonald opened the main citadel of his empire in the year 1873 at the corner of Clark and Monroe Streets. The 4-story complex had it all: a luxurious casino, a first-class hotel, a bar, and a restaurant. The store was the largest gambling center in Chicago. If the main characters of Todd Phillips's famous film had lived in the late 19th century, they would have celebrated their bachelor party not in Vegas, which was then a village in the desert, but in Chicago. For Mike, the store became a springboard into a serious game. The gambling house of the King of Chicago attracted the elite from various echelons, from politicians and businessmen to criminal masterminds. The Irishman became a genuine matchmaker for the upper echelons of the state of Illinois. Major business deals, tense negotiations, and political agreements, everything went through MacDonald. By the year 1885 in Chicago, the phrase "meet with Mike" had become a catchphrase among all the city's officials and criminals. If someone needed to get a person out of jail, influence a judge, or pass a city ordinance, they met with Mike. The Irishman placed his main bet on politicians. He did not personally participate in elections, but that was not his style. Mike played differently. He sponsored those he deemed necessary, who then defended his interest and, for example, did not close his not entirely legal establishment, the store. MacDonald also did not forget about journalists. He invested tens of thousands of dollars in the popular newspaper of the time, the Globe. The investments paid off. The Irishman managed to dethrone the Republicans who were constantly putting obstacles in his path. However, even such a giant of prejudicial thought, the father of Chicago democracy, could not control everything. MacDonald was betrayed by his sense of impunity. He constantly embezzled from the city budget and did so with increasing brazenness each year. In the year 1887, he was caught in an atypically primitive scheme for him. This is what overconfidence leads to. Through his firm, he tried to successfully exploit a large sum while renovating the courthouse. The press, which MacDonald didn't pay off entirely, uncovered the scheme. This was the first blow to the Irishman. But the real trouble came from an unexpected source, his beloved woman. In August of 1889, Mike's wife ran off to Paris with a Catholic priest whom the Irishman had hired as a spiritual mentor for his beloved. The family drama hit him hard. His own associates understood this and decided they had grown fangs to bite the boss's hand. For example, the mayor of the city, whom the Irishman himself had brought to power. The now elderly politician decided he could advance without the support of the city's shadow king. Soon, the mayor was found with a bullet in his head at his home. The official version was that the politician's opponent went mad and shot the mayor in broad daylight. But the entire city understood. The Irishman was behind it. Jupiter was enraged, which meant he was losing control. And then MacDonald made a second fatal mistake. He married a former classmate of his son's. She was 25 at the time. This marriage became yet another trial. The woman could regularly publicly reprimand and mock him, and even beat him in front of people. He was the main crime boss of Chicago, and she betrayed her beloved husband with a 15-year-old schoolboy. Then came another plot twist. She found out that this schoolboy was also cheating on her. The Irishman's wife could no longer endure it, and during another fight killed her lover and in doing so destroyed her husband's reputation. Legal battles, his wife's prison term, mockery in the press. All of this crushed the 68-year-old king of Chicago. On the 9th of August in the year 1907, his shattered heart finally stopped. This event prompted the disintegration of the Irishman's empire. His heirs could not peacefully divide what they had inherited. The conflict spilled out onto the streets of Chicago. For almost 20 years, the City of Winds was plagued with gunfire and the smoke from fires. These years would be remembered by the residents of Chicago as the Gambling Wars. Now, imagine yourself in the place of an average city dweller in the year 1916. You read in the newspapers about the terrible war in Europe. Thousands of soldiers are dying under shell fire and bombs, suffocating in the trenches from poisonous gases. And at the same time, right outside your window, there's chaos. A real urban war is raging in the streets. City Hall not only fails to manage the situation, but it is already thoroughly corrupt and also participates in this slaughter. Outraged crowds of citizens took to the streets of Chicago. A city that was once free from xenophobia began to hate the Irish. Ironically, in fleeing from condemnation and criminal wars, the Irish had brought both to Chicago. They protested, as Protestants do. The deeply religious and angry residents of Chicago insisted that all these criminal wars were due to the nation's descent into sin. Media more frequently began to write that gambling and alcohol were the scourge of the American nation, and therefore needed to be prohibited as soon as possible. The protests, triggered by the skirmishes of Irish gangs in Chicago, initiated a new era in the criminal history of America, the era of Prohibition. Prohibition presented the Irish with an opportunity they had missed half a century earlier. The 1920s began triumphantly for them. Irish bootleggers were the first to seize the moment, establishing supply chains, subjugating the police, and co-opting local officials. What kind of Irish would they be if they couldn't make money on their beloved liquor? This success had two reasons. First, the Irish still dominated the criminal milieu of the States. Secondly, and more importantly, the gangs themselves began to change. The Irish gradually moved away from their clan model in favour of classical criminal corporations, thanks to Uncle MacDonald and the melting pot of New York, which effectively fought against xenophobia. One problem was that their rapid success made them dizzy. If they had been more cautious, they would have noticed that their heads were already spinning on the chopping block. We have spoken many times in our series about the success of their competitors, the Italians. I will remind you that the Italian Mafia had long operated in the shadow of their red-bearded comrades, but in this shadow they were not idling. Take, for instance, the same 5 Points gang, future kings of the criminal world, Lucky Luciano, the godfather of Vegas, Bugsy Siegel, Al Capone. All of them passed through this gang. Italians and Jews knew well how the Irish conducted their affairs. They understood their habits, customs. They had been watching, copying, and learning from them for years. The Irish eventually became complacent, and it played a cruel trick on them. In the new complex structure of the black economy, the Irish were not faring well. The coordination between gangs was weak, connections with suppliers and police unreliable. It was on these weaknesses that the Italians pressed. The war began unexpectedly, with the Italians in New York choosing not to dirty their hands and instead unleashing politicians and police under their control against the Irish. The Irish underground empire was crumbling. Ships carrying alcohol from Canada were turned away before reaching port. Then the Italians started to cut the already weak ropes, tying different groups together, buying off some to pit them against others. It was a national Irish sport. As a result, the gang leaders either rotted behind bars or ended up buried. The henchmen scattered far and wide, most often under the Italians' umbrella. The history of the Irish in Chicago ended with much more bloodshed. Al Capone took hold of the city that once belonged to MacDonald. He entered the bootlegging market without knocking. His first move was to eliminate his main competitor, an Irishman named Dean O'Banion. In November 1924, 2 armed Italians burst into Dean's flower shop. They caught O'Banion off guard. The assassin worked with precision and cold-bloodedness. 2 bullets to the chest, 2 bullets to the neck. To the heirs of Mike MacDonald, Capone showed particular attention. He sent heavily armed mercenaries to them, who gunned down nearly the entire upper echelon of the Irish gang. Those who survived fled the city and never resurfaced for the rest of their lives. The Irish missed the opportunity that Prohibition gave them. New York was lost. Chicago was taken over by new, efficient, ruthless, and cooperative players. Not a trace remained of MacDonald's and the Dead Rabbits empire. Well, is that all? The end of the episode? Well, I think we understand that the Irish succeed not because of, but in spite of the odds. And here in our story appears a man who managed to revive what seemed beyond resurrection. With his brutality on one hand and shrewd mind on the other, this player turned the criminal world of the New World upside down. Meet Whitey Bulger. Whitey is the son of that very Irish youth who, remember, lost his hand and left New York for a better life. The young man then headed northeast, moved to Massachusetts, and settled in Boston. At that time, thousands of Irish were heading there, and for obvious reasons. It was the 1930s, the peak of the Great Depression. Millions of workers, and as we recall, Irish immigrants were mostly proletarians, were left without jobs and money. There was nothing to live on, nothing to lose. In the Southern District of Boston, a program for the construction of public housing for the indigent had just been launched. The Bulger family, along with hundreds of other Irish families, settled in one such housing unit in the south of the city. This was yet another reason why the Bulgers chose Boston. The city had long been a centre for Irish Americans. Chicago also maintained ties with the community despite the dismantling of those gangs. This is what the city looks like during the celebration of St. Patrick's Day. The river that cuts through the centre of Chicago is dyed green every year. But Boston is, of course, a much more Irish place. It's known that the Celts favoured it since at least the 17th century. Being a port city, it took merely a month and a half to reach from Ireland by sea in good weather. For many refugees, Boston was just a transit point to get to New York, but many settled right there. By the mid-19th century, there were 35,000 Irish living there. By today's standards, this might seem insignificant, but back then, it was a quarter of the entire city. That's why Boston seems to many the most European of American cities. The Irish settled in and created an environment similar to what they were used to on the Emerald Isle. The Irish influence in Boston is so strong that the city developed its own accent. This is how it's parodied by Louis C.K., the legendary comedian of Irish descent who grew up in Boston.
People call it the Boston accent. It's not an accent. It's a whole city of people saying most words wrong. Because my teachers, they teach you to talk like that. My teacher, I had a teacher named Miss Doherty, but she thought her name was Mrs. Darity.
As a result, Boston became a city where Irish heritage is preserved more than anywhere else in the States. Even the symbolism of the Boston Celtics, the local team that became the NBA champion last season, simultaneously references the Celts, leprechauns and shamrocks. These are all national symbols of Ireland. In this vividly green environment lived Whitey Bulger, the main figure of our story. He loved football, attended parish school, but struggled academically with mostly mediocre grades. Studying did not interest him, unlike what was happening in the streets. If you've painted a picture in your mind of Bulger as a typical Irish hoodlum from a poor family, you're right, but only partially. On the one hand, he regularly roughed up neighborhood kids. He worked out with weights at home, then wandered the area looking for boys to beat up. On the other hand, in the eyes of adults, he was a true gentleman. He always greeted them, helped carry groceries, and generally behaved very gallantly. This dualism of a street thug and a European gentleman would become his signature even in his criminal career. When exactly he delved into it, we don't know, but by the age of 14 he was caught stealing from freight trucks. The cops arrested him and during questioning beat him to near death. He recalled them breaking his arm and shoving a gun in his mouth. But Whitey didn't give up his own. The story ended for him in a juvenile detention center. By the year 1948, it was clear that he wouldn't finish school. He enlisted in the United States Air Force, but even there he didn't fare well. Constant fights and insubordination of orders resulted in yet another prison term for him, only already in the military. Like his school education, his military education did not work out either, and in the year 1952 he was dismissed from the Air Force. The fate of the gallant hooligan Whitey Bulger was sealed. It was then that Whitey fully immersed himself in crime. His first refuge was the Shamrock Gang, a neighborhood gang of Irish Americans from South Boston, with whom Bulger had played football since childhood. Our hooligan helped them with petty crimes, stealing a car here, participating in a mugging there, and nothing out of the ordinary. You might wonder right now, how did Irish gangsters appear in Boston in the mid-20th century? Let us not forget that by those years the Great Depression had ended decades ago. Post-war America, well, after a couple of years of recessions, was awash with money. Economic prosperity had reached even the perpetually disadvantaged Irish. Their traditionally blue collars rapidly turned white. They moved into offices and normal homes. They even had John Kennedy. His great-grandfather was an Irish immigrant. And unlike other presidents, who also had Irish ancestry, he was very proud of his roots. And when he became president, he assembled his team, including many officials of Irish descent. So where did gangs like Shamrock come from then? It so happened that the rise in the standard of living for the Irish passed by the southern area of Boston. It was an economically depressed place, a real backwater. As a result, there was high unemployment, ethnic isolation, and other social miseries. And this played into the hands of the wayward Whitey. Having played enough with the footballers, he moved up a level and began robbing banks. Amusingly, even in this dubious line of work, Bulger maintained his usual gallantry. A woman who personally witnessed a bank robbery in Ruderland, which is south of Boston, literally an hour's drive away, recounted that Whitey addressed her using all the clichés from gangster films. He complimented the bank branch's appearance and, looking her directly in the eyes, said, "Lady, I won't harm you unless not kissing your hand is a harm in itself." In just about 6 months, the bank robberies brought this punk's gang 1.2 million modern dollars, and also a court sentence, 20 years in a federal prison, and he spent this time productively. In the first 2 years of his sentence, Whitey spent a month and a half in solitary confinement due to brawls. Then Bulger realized that he should try to reduce his sentence rather than prolong it with such antics. And so he enlisted in the infamously known MK Ultra, a secret CIA program where real experiments were conducted on participants. The CIA was trying to create the perfect truth serum, tools for recruitment and mind control. Decades later, all would be revealed and the law enforcement officials would be condemned for these human rights abuses, but that was of little comfort to Bulger at the time. For each month of participation in the experiment, his detention was reduced by 3 days. In the end, Bulger was administered substances, note, for 18 months straight. In his diaries, he later wrote that it was a true nightmare, and the experiment plunged him into the depths of madness. Until the end of his life, he suffered from nightmares, heard voices in his head, and feared that the CIA would deal with him if he told anyone about the experiment. After participating in the MK Ultra program, Whitey was transferred to Alcatraz, and this prison, one of the most famous in the world, became his rest home. There, unexpectedly, he developed a thirst for knowledge, completing all the correspondence courses he could access. Accounting, commerce, typing. Bulger buried himself in books on history and political philosophy, particularly drawn to Niccolo Machiavelli's works The Prince and The Art of War. Let's highlight the main takeaways that Bulger emphasized for himself. It is not certain, by the way, that Machiavelli wrote them in exactly this way. What matters is how Whitey interpreted them for himself. First, the end justifies the means. Second, a successful leader must manipulate people. And third, powerful people are obliged to disregard morality and ethics. The rest of the time, Whitey devoted to sports and maintaining the reputation of a courteous gentleman. During his incarceration, he even received an honorary certificate for helping patients in physical therapy, teamwork skills, and notably, a cheerful disposition. The reputation worked as intended. 9 years later, Bulger was released on parole and returned to South Boston, traumatized, well-read, and very dangerous. His family initially tried to help him settle down, with a politician brother securing him a job at the local courthouse as a janitor. But Whitey Bulger had his own plans. He joined the most influential gang in South Boston and quickly became its main weapon, which was indeed a big problem. It was already the 1970s. The Vietnam War was drawing to a close. In the United States, demobilized military personnel were returning en masse. The Irish also fought and were returning from Vietnam. In South Boston, which was thoroughly Irish, they formed their own organized crime group. Soon, a war erupted between them and Bulger's gang, claiming the lives of about 20 people. At least one of them was killed personally by Whitey. But here was the problem. By the end of the war, Bulger's gang had lost its influence. Soon, a new gang, Winter Hill, took over Boston. While small organized crime groups traditionally engaged in petty crime and were busy killing each other, Winter Hill mastered the niche of underground gambling and rose to the major leagues. These bandits did not like the state of affairs in Boston at all. They wanted to stop the war. The gang of veterans quickly came under the protection of Winter Hill and was already ready to break Bulger's group, which wanted independence. That was when Whitey made his first decisive move. Sidestepping the leadership, he went to secret negotiations with Winter Hill and the veterans, after which he came to meet with his boss and said, "It's over, you're out, no more warnings." And so Bulger, the newly minted head of the gang under the protection of the largest organized crime group in Boston, rose very high, but did not stop there. Whitey managed to convince the bosses of Winter Hill to start internal purges. Heads immediately began to roll in the gang. The bodies of the main functionaries of the gang were found all over Boston. The big bosses eradicated any disloyalty within their inner circle, but they did not realize that they were effectively dancing to the tune of that brazen Irishman. Whitey naturally began with the veterans. They were still fixated on him for a wartime murder and sought revenge. The body of a cell leader was found buried on one of Boston's beaches. People began to fear Bulger. If anyone so much as glanced at him the wrong way, that person became a walking corpse, just to understand the scale of the personality. Once in a bar, a gang member conversed with Whitey, and during the dialogue aggressively clenched his fist. Whitey noticed. A week later, the gangster, deemed too audacious and rude, was killed. Bulger skillfully turned the Winter Hill boss's paranoia to his advantage. The threat was averted, but trouble still loomed. The feds descended on the gang. Associates of our protagonist began to be jailed like potatoes for racketeering, fraud, and illegal bookmaking, but nobody touched Whitey. Although understanding that he was one of the key players in this scheme was not a hard task, why was that? Again, Machiavellianism. All those years, the Irishman cooperated with the FBI. From the viewpoint of any Irish gangster, this was a mortal sin. Informers were worse than rats to them, but Whitey Bulger would not be himself if he didn't break all the rules time and again. Let's rewind a bit. In the 1940s, when Whitey was in his 20s and still just a notable thug in his neighborhood, he met a boy named John Connolly in a local store. Bulger bought the kid an ice cream. Word by word, they became friends. The gallant thug protected him from older guys and taught him the ropes. So, 30 years pass, it's the 1970s. Bulger, as we remember, is one of Boston's main gangsters. And little John Connolly, over those 30 years, has become an FBI special agent. You understand, the Irishman kept such a friend as close as possible. The main headache for the FBI in those years was the Italian Cosa Nostra. Connolly, who wanted to quickly advance his career, remembered his childhood friend. He told Whitey that the Cosa Nostra wanted to take him out, so it was in his best interest to become an informant. He knew that Bulger had enough knowledge and connections to completely divulge the Cosa Nostra's leaders. Bulger agreed to work, but made a counter-proposal to Connolly. "I'll leak information from the criminal world to you, and you'll leak information from the feds to me. Warn me about wiretaps, raids, and cover for me when necessary. I pay a lot." Childhood friends shook hands. First, Whitey ratted out the Italians and then his own bosses. They were imprisoned for organizing illegal horse racing, while Whitey Bulger took control of the gang into his own hands. With a simple motion of his unscrupulous hand, the Irishman rid himself of external and internal competition. The Winter Hill gang and Bulger himself began to live their best lives, not without difficulties. In the 1980s, states began to massively legalize the gambling business. For this, the United States launched the state lottery. It began to eat away at the criminal gambling business's main asset-compulsive gamblers. No problem, thought Bulger, and realized that instead of the grey gambling zone, he needed to explore the black yet evergreen niche. This became banned substances. Winter Hill began to protect drug dealers. If you dared to trade without giving Uncle Whitey a cut, they would catch you, pull out your teeth to make the body unidentifiable, and bury you on the Atlantic shore, just a stone's throw from the ocean. As we know today, from racketeering alone, Bulger earned $25 million over his career. How much money he made from trafficking can only be speculated. After the Boston hoodlum took the post of boss, Winter Hill began to conduct their business more organized. Here, a clarification is necessary. Despite the high stakes, the gang still operated rather chaotically. There was no clear structure or hierarchy. Although Whitey was unable to turn Winter Hill into a corporation, or at least a Mexican cartel, this organized crime group operated very centrally. For example, they had their own auto repair shop, the main headquarters, and simultaneously a legal cover for shady dealings. It is essential to emphasize that everything in the gang revolved around Bulger's figure. That's why in the Italian Mafia, the bandits respected the Don. The logic is such. I serve the Don not only because my father served him, but also because he is a sensible man and knows what he is doing. This recalls the sociologist Weber's theory, the traditional and rationally legal type of political domination. The Irish worked with a slightly different scheme. In their gangs, the boss needed to have personal, exceptional charisma. The Irish boss must not only be fearsome, effective, and respected, but also should be able to drink more beer than the rest and break the face of any offender if necessary. Remember that same Michael Corleone, a fictional hero, but no less realistic for it. A character like him could not have become the head of an Irish gang. What's with Michael? All lost, nervous, his wife cheating on him. However, at Winter Hill, everything was built on the charisma of its leader, Mr. Bulger. Even when he became a multimillionaire, He personally went to settle scores and took people down with his own fists. A striking image kept the Winter Hill gang in line. But the Irishman was playing with fire because the only condition set by his FBI handlers was not to kill anyone. One time, Whitey's associates wanted to betray him. In the year 1982, an ordinary gang member was suspected of murder and decided to trade information about Bulger's shady dealings for freedom. This was a mistake. Connolly, a friend of the gallant hooligan from the FBI, immediately told Whitey that he was being betrayed. A couple of months later, he personally shot up the car where his former colleague and his completely uninvolved friend sat, with a rifle. Both were killed. The source of Bulger's love for violence is clear. It was their charismatic type of leadership and personal traumas. Subsequently, MKUltra did not go anywhere. He continued to suffer from hallucinations and nightmares, so severe that you wouldn't wish them on your enemy. There was a legend that the personal psychiatrist of the Irishman was forced to refuse his patient because he could not bear the retelling of his bloody fantasies. As is often the case, a criminal was ruined by high politic. The boss of Winter Hill had a great fondness for the Irish Republican Army, the very same IRA. It fought for the freedom of Northern Ireland. The rest of Ireland had already gained independence from Britain in the 1920s, but the northern part of the island still remained under the Crown. South Boston, in this conflict, naturally rooted for its own. And Bulger was almost the main fan of the IRA. Even as a small-time crook, he was already donating to them. When he became the city's main criminal, he realized he could now provide support directly. He met with army commanders and began sending them rifles and explosives across the ocean. The radicals actively used Bulger's shipments in hundreds of terrorist attacks in London and throughout Britain. Everything went smoothly until one of the arms shipments was uncovered by the police. One of the crew members later confessed to working with Winter Hill. Thanks to a friend from the FBI, Bulger quickly figured out who the traitor was. The talker was buried right in White's house basement. But this was already the beginning of the end. Clouds were gathering over Boston's main gangster. A bloody trail of dozens of murders followed White. To add insult to injury, John Connolly decided to leave the FBI. It was the year 1990. The special agent was dismissed with honors, and he only managed to warn his old friend. They were digging beneath him. Until 1994, Bulger maintained control over Boston's criminal underworld, but in December, Connolly learned that the US Department of Justice was preparing charges against him. The boss at Winter Hill was to be arrested at Christmas. White went on the run. Law enforcement descended on Bulger's closest associates. At first, they took the hit. But when they found out how many years the boss had been cooperating with the authorities, they struck a deal. Just for the information that would help catch White, a reward of $2 million was offered. The only higher price then was on Osama bin Laden. So what do you think? How long does the average American gangster spend on the run? A month? A year? And a gangster from the list of America's top 10 most wanted? 16.5 years. This Machiavellian bandit had everything covered. A couple of years before he fled, Bulger went on a journey. Like the Wolf of Wall Street, along with an associate, he traveled all over Europe. But not for tourist purposes at all. He was creating a new identity for himself, a man named Thomas Baxter, with all the necessary passports and credit cards. As a bonus, he hid safes filled with cash, jewels, and passports in various locations across the United States, Canada, Ireland, Britain, and Italy. Therefore, when Whitey went on the run, he did not have to hide in alleyways like Pablo Escobar. He traveled the world calmly, confident about his future. He surfaced in places such as Uruguay, a cinema in London, bookstores in Canada, and the Santa Monica Pier in California. An associate who managed to encounter Bulger over those 16 years wrote in his memoirs, "I don't think he'll ever be caught. If he has a gun with him, he'd rather go out in a blaze of glory than spend the rest of his life in prison." But the moment of glory never came. In the year 2011, 81-year-old Whitey Bulger was lured out of his Santa Monica apartment through deceit. By that time, his dear friend and accomplice John Connolly had already been imprisoned for 6 years. It turned out that Connolly received $250,000 in bribes from his senior associate, and committed a contract murder for him. The former FBI officer, by the way, is still alive. He's 84 and was recently released from prison on health grounds. Whitey Bulger's fate turned out differently. He was found guilty of 11 murders, racketeering and firearms possession. As a result, he received 2 life sentences plus 5 years for deterrence. In his later years, Bulger actively descended into madness, harassing prison staff and threatening them with murder. His final resting place became a prison in West Virginia in 2018. Local inmates were already aware that a big star and a big snitch was coming their way. Upon the 89-year-old Whitey's arrival, he was beaten to death, so much so that his corpse was nearly unrecognizable. Inspired by this story, albeit before Bulger's tragic demise, Martin Scorsese managed to create another timeless film, The Departed. However, the movie ends differently than in real life, and certainly it doesn't address who would become Bulger's heir in Europe. The Irish gangs of the past are over. An era has ended. Criminal organizations like Dead Rabbit and Underhill have outlived themselves and were crushed. Do you remember how their story began? Mass migration and discrimination left the Irish stuck in a marginal lifestyle from which they couldn't escape. By the end of the 19th century, the situation slowly began to change. During the Civil War, they proved that they had as much right to call themselves Americans as other immigrants. Political structures like Tammany Hall mercilessly exploited the Irish, but for many, this social elevator lifted them quite high into public service, business and politics like the Kennedy clan. And if you compare the Irish with other diasporas, their chances for assimilation were much higher. All of them knew English, their skin was white, they were Catholics but still Christian. Ultimately, the Irish became an example of perhaps the most successful assimilation in US history. Nearly 10% of the US population, which is 32 million people, have Irish roots. The religious divide has also faded away. Through the efforts of Irish and Italian migrants, today, every fifth American peacefully practices Catholicism. Economic discrimination is also a thing of the past. On the contrary, the average American descendant of Irish immigrants earns $79,000 a year, which is $5,000 more than the median income of Americans. Consequently, the Irish gangs in America, which formed as a response to discrimination and social maladies, lost out not only to other organized crime groups, but to economic growth and assimilation as well, which, frankly, isn't so bad. As for Ireland itself, at that time, it had been independent for many years. 30 to 40 years ago, the country experienced an economic miracle. The government lowered taxes, attracted billions in investments, and by the early 2000s, the unemployment rate had dropped fourfold, from 26% to 5%. The GDP grew at a rate of 9.4% per year, akin to China, during its own economic miracle. One of Europe's poorest nations was rapidly becoming one of the richest. However, the economic growth did not reach everyone. Around the year 2000, about 10% of the population lived below the poverty line, including the most vulnerable group, the elderly and the youth. They lived not on the outskirts, but in the centres of major cities. Districts of Dublin, for example, were scattered with social housing for the poor. Young men from underprivileged families watched through their bedroom windows the affluent life they could not afford. This is how the main Irish organised crime group of our times, which I mentioned at the beginning of the video, the Kinahan, emerged. Named after its founder, Christy Kinahan. Initially, Christy was a villain akin to those from Scooby-Doo. Just when he would set up a criminal scheme, car theft, check fraud or drug dealing, he would quickly be caught and sent to prison. Kinahan didn't spend much time there, would get out, and promptly return to his old ways. Over his career, he was arrested 5 times and incarcerated 3 times, serving a total of more than 10 years. In the 1990s, Kinahan realized that sitting in prison was somewhat dull. He began reshaping himself after the image of Whitey Bulger. In prison, he earned 2 academic degrees, learned several languages, and established a vast network of connections. After his release, he flew directly to Amsterdam to start building his drug empire there. The capital of the Netherlands provided all the conditions for this. The decriminalization of certain drugs didn't kill, but fueled the demand for hard substances. Such things couldn't be obtained in legal shops, yet underground dealers found that their client base was only expanding. This is the niche that Kinahan filled. He became the main drug wholesaler in Amsterdam. Looking at Bulger, whose empire collapsed at the snap of law enforcement's fingers, Kinahan realized he shouldn't put all his eggs in one basket. While trafficking ships sailed from the Netherlands to Ireland, his sons recruited groups all over Dublin. Afterward, Kinahan's network extended across all of Britain and Spain. But judge for yourself, running such a dangerous business in several European countries alone is an absolutely unrealistic task. Therefore, the Kinahans rose above their own egos and began to cooperate with other organized crime groups, which handled distribution on their behalf. The Irish organized crime group transformed into an international super cartel. They established distribution relations with Balkan crime groups, Italian families, British gangs, the Chinese Mafia, and even the motorcycle club Hell's Angels. The scheme is the same everywhere. The Kinahans order substances from Colombia and Mexico, ship them to Europe in containers, bribe port employees to avoid issues during reception, and distribute everything to local distributors. The profits they earn are laundered either through gambling or through endless businesses in Dubai. It is there, according to the police, that the Kinahan leaders, including Christie himself, now 68 years old, are hiding today. The family's capital is estimated to be no less than $1 billion. The new generation of Celtic gangs has caught up with and surpassed their predecessors. Notably, the influence of Irish gangs can be seen not only in the drug market but also in professional sports. One of the legitimate enterprises of Kinahan's elder son was his own fighting promotion, MTK Global. Here, one of the largest gangsters of modern times has managed to work with the legendary Tyson Fury. Kinahan managed to organize a fight for Fury against Anthony Joshua, and everyone was content. However, when the ownership of the company came to light, Fury was banned from entering the United States. Even stronger ties, however, were established by the Kinahans with Conor McGregor. Conor, originally from Dublin, grew up and lived literally next door to this family. But when his sister Aoife started dating a convicted drug dealer from the cartel, it became clear they walked the same paths. Conor occasionally appears with the gangsters in joint photos, and they come to his pub for a beer. These connections ignited a major scandal in the media. Articles emerged suggesting that McGregor was practically an active participant in criminal schemes. In Ireland, the topic of organised crime is sensitive and often discussed. However, looking at the bare numbers, the country is becoming calmer. The number of violent crimes decreases by several % each year. Today, Celtic gangs have blended into global criminal networks as deftly as the Irish diaspora in the United States. They are no longer drunken cutthroats, but ruthless and cynical professionals who outwit Americans from the DEA and International Interpol. The history of Irish gangs is the saga of a people displaced from their homeland, humiliated in emigration, seemingly having forgotten what a peaceful life is. The Irish came to the New World as victims, but quickly became a threat to it. They learned to use chaos to their advantage. Discrimination and humiliation became the fuel for their self-organization. Yet, the clan structure under the new conditions never became monolithic. Irish gangs are the product of cultural trauma and perpetual exile. Their history is a constant pendulum between the struggle for justice and self-destruction. And the latter, as we can see, has prevailed.